Welcome to one of my favorite subjects, the transportation revolution. In the 19th century, rapid and revolutionary technological change took place in transportation technology. And this transformation sped westward expansion through the simple effect of moving population westward. With people came goods, commerce, communications, and institutions via the same transportation methods. And westward expansion, as I argued last time, made the sectional divisions that would lead eventually to civil war worse. So the transportation revolution knitted the country together physically, but also contributed to how it tore itself apart. But technology does not develop within a vacuum. It is shaped by its context, by cultural expectations, like who can ride a train alone, and who needs a reason for being there. Related to the question of who is a person, with what legal rights and obligations. Technology is also shaped by economics, who finances a canal and how. The institutions play a role too, the laws and the banks and the available materials and how they arrive. All of these elements play a role in making a technology work in a specific time and place. So it was with the transportation revolution of the 19th century, and this is a side argument to my lecture. In addition to making a point about American history and the coming of the Civil War, I'm also demonstrating the way that context matters in explaining technological change. That society causes technology, as much as technology changes society. But let's begin with the hardware. Last time, I discussed this painting by John Gast called Manifest Destiny. It depicts an allegory of American westward expansion, but also the series of transportation projects that took part in that expansion. Here, you can see the covered wagon, characteristic of the overland trail that moved population over the Great Plains toward the California gold rush in the 1850s. Behind it appears a stagecoach, which shows regular trips from one settled location to another, and behind that come the railroads, following the path of the telegraph wire. Connecting New York City, here the faint representation of the Brooklyn Bridge, up in the corner, connecting the great port city with the interior, and the settling of the West. And like so much else in our story, the painting is not just an allegory. It was really happening. Look at these maps. They show how long it took to get from one place to another in the 19th century, and they're going to show a serious acceleration as transportation projects linked the US closer together, but also contributed to breaking apart into civil war. So here goes. Here's the hook, and here's the whale, pointing to New York City. In 1800, it would take 3 days to get down to the Chesapeake, or 5 days to get to the other side of it. A full week to get to the Carolinas, and 2 weeks to get to Florida. It would take a month of steady travel to get from New York to New Orleans, or up into the thumb part of the glove of Michigan, up by Lake Erie. But now look at 1830. The times had been cut in half. You could get to the Carolinas in 4 or 5 days. To Florida in a week. To New Orleans in 2 weeks. Transportation was speeding up. This is 1857, and the times had split in half again, actually even faster than that. It took only a couple of days to make it down to the Carolinas, less than a week from New York to New Orleans, and only 2 days to make it into the thumb of Michigan, at the Great Lakes. By 1930, of course, you could get across the country in like 4 days, fast as today, unless you fly. Let's talk about the actual systems of transportation that made this revolution possible. How did people get from place to place in the 19th century? And how did that technology change? First, Anybody who knows the Lubbock alleys know that unpaved roads turn into mud and then dry out. They tend to rut in the rain, so a simple road with paving of some sort is a technological improvement. And the British colonists were taking down forests in order to build ships in the north and to clear land for big farms in the south, and they used some of the logs they cut down to pave the roads. It's called a corduroy road because it's got rows of logs making bumps like corduroy fabric. And look, here's a photograph of the archaeological remnants of one in Virginia. There are little bits of them preserved in the old plantation south. Here, you can see them being built out of cut-down logs and used in the automobile era, probably some colonial setting. These are still an option in developing countries that still have some forests left for the purpose. But wood is less durable than stone, and paving roadways with stone has an old, old history. The Romans linked together their large empire by building roads that armies, goods, government could use to get around. The Romans constructed roads so well that remnants of them can be found today all over the European world and former Roman Empire. From before the birth of Christ, it was a big empire. There are Roman roads all over Eurasia. You can see from this image the cutaway that shows how many layers went into supporting and draining the roadbed that carried people and goods, animals and carts. You can also see the kind of hierarchical society involved in planning these roads, engineering them over such great distances, and getting them built. It's also a major expense. In the 19th century, paving roads with stones took on an industrial quality, with reproducible macadam paving methods that were employed across the young United States, especially its cities. Macadam involved compacting small stones in asphalt over a prepared roadbed in a patented way. The inventor was a Scotsman named John Loudon Macadam, whose name became associated with a type of paving commonly used across America. Scots had a reputation as great engineers in the 19th century. They were associated somewhat with the textile machinery of the Industrial Revolution and with the steam engine. There's a reason the ship's engineer on the original Star Trek was named Scotty and had a Scottish accent.
Captain. Scotty. Help. Well, now, what do you think of that?
The next hot transportation technology of westward expansion was the canals, which linked up the coast to interior riverways and settlements. The canals were waterways carved through the landscape that could carry goods over hills and almost mountains by a simple mechanical system of locks. Here's how it worked. One more time, because I love the technology. Besides, the canals are a big part of the reason for the expansion of this red blob, representing one day's travel between 1830 and 1857. This one growing red blob can be ascribed almost entirely to the Erie Canal, and I'll talk more about the specific cases of the new technology in just a moment. First, let me finish the big picture. The signature technology of the 19th century transportation revolution was the railroads. Another improvement borrowed from Britain. The railroads consisted of two parts. First was the locomotive itself, which was an engine that burned coal to propel trains of cars. Here's a schematic of how the steam engine coal-powered railway worked. Second, the locomotive was precisely fitted to iron rails on which those locomotives pulled those trains, iron rails of uniform industrial production. The first railroad system was built at Darlington, in England, up near the Scottish border, near a coal mine, where the railroad was built to get the coal to the sea for transport and sale, and it burnt some of the coal from the mine in order to do so. It's said that people first caught a ride on top of the coal, but before too long, the railroad offered service to move people. And the idea caught on. This is an image from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in the 1830s and carried cotton from the port at Liverpool, cotton which had arrived over the Atlantic from the slave plantations in the American South, carried American cotton to the mills of Manchester and the British Industrial Revolution. At the Railway Museum in York, in the north of England, I saw some early versions of the railroad technology, which used gears on the wheels and on the rails. Not yet sure that the friction of moving would keep the two together. It takes time to figure out how new technology works. It's not just a simple one-off flash of invention. The US had tougher conditions, bigger mountains to get around, but here's the system of railroads in the US in 1850 and in 1860. Railroads are responsible for a big part of the jump between this image in 1857 and this one in 1930. So this is a bare-bones account of these various successive technologies and how they worked, what I would call an internalist history of the technology. The story is internal to the transportation systems themselves. It doesn't make reference to anything outside the hardware, but I want you to understand why the technology worked, the institutional frameworks, the financing and the interests it expressed, and therefore the path that development took, as part of understanding the transportation revolution. The adoption and application of these technologies to real-world conditions, of course, had to take account of those conditions. Policy made technology possible, even as changes in the technology were hurried along by changes in institutions, in laws, and in the finance, the way people or states invested money. And of course, for any technology to be profitable, there has to be a market, and Americans were already moving westward, there to buy and sell goods via the transportation system, which connected them to markets. It's a chicken and egg situation. Think of the roads being built around Lubbock. They both stimulate growth out on the loop, out on the brownfield spur. But they also count on growth, or else they're just a waste of money, a bridge to nowhere. Technology sits at a weird position between causing social change and being caused by it. To take an example, let's turn to the roads with which I began this lecture, the pavement systems that carried Americans into the West. I start with the Great Wagon Road, as it's called here, the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. But even starting there, this technology relied on what had come before. This road had prehistorical roots. It was, first of all, an Indian path, part of a network of paths that natives used to trade and communicate with each other. From here, see the Chesapeake Bay, and this reaches from Philadelphia down to the border of Carolina and Georgia. Stretching behind the coastal plain, a great warpath that Americans borrowed and used and called the Great Wagon Road. By the 1740s, Americans are already using this road, part of the westward expansion that the British wanted to curtail to maintain peace with the natives and with the French. By the 1760s, the Americans had widened it enough to allow wagons to pass. And of course, after the Revolution, expansion continued. Those 70,000 settlers that entered Kentucky to make it a state by 1792 from Virginia sprang out from the Great Wagon Road here at Big Lick, where they began their passage through the Cumberland Gap, through the Appalachian Mountains, and into the West. Here, a system of roads through the Cumberland Gap. The American migrants' success at settlement led to the construction of a national road that stretched from the Chesapeake, eventually all the way to St. Louis, and the start of the Overland Trail. Construction began in 1811 Baltimore and reached Wheeling in what is today West Virginia by 1818. A decade later, it had stretched to the other side of Ohio, and then Indiana by 1832, and across Illinois to St. Louis by 1838. It was a national road. It crossed state lines and required planning on a national scale. It ran about 620 miles and linked the Chesapeake, part of the original 13 colonies, to the Mississippi River. Acquired from the French after U.S. independence only about 25 years before this road reached the river. It was paved with variants of macadam, and today is part of Interstate 40, likewise a national road, financed by federal government and debt in the form of bonds. The National Road of 1818 to 1838 likewise stimulated private investment in further growth from the interior to the coast. Here's the system of roads and turnpikes, privately owned roads that charged a fee to use them, in the USA in 1829. The transport system of roads undergirded westward expansion, but was pushed along by it, too. This was about the same period that canals were the hot transportation technology. It started in the U.S. with the Erie Canal, a project built by New York State. Remember this picture from an earlier lecture, with New York at the bottom, where the whale points? And this is the Hudson River that streams from the St. Lawrence Seaway, which becomes the Great Lakes. The Erie Canal was imagined to improve the links between the Hudson River at Albany and Lake Ontario, here. Imagined since at least 1768, a canal was first proposed in 1808, which is when the New York State Legislature funded a survey to find possible routes. In 1817, the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, broke the ground. In the 8 years it took to dig the canal, it was often referred to as Clinton's Big Ditch, but when the canal finally opened in 1825, it changed the world. Connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River meant connecting New York City and its glorious port to the whole Midwest, through the thumb of Michigan and Ohio, Indiana, up over to Wisconsin, and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It opened the region to commercial farming. This is a grain boat. You could just drop it in the canal and float it to market. It also spread cities and sites of industrial development. Cities along the Erie Canal were the first movers of American industrialization and are today the Rust Belt, decaying relics of the canal age. And just as the National Road had done, the Erie Canal inspired a whole host of other canal improvements. Not only the Erie Canal, but across the whole Midwest, canals linked commercial centers, cities, and factory spots. The steamboat era that carried goods on rivers and canals. The steamboat era that carried goods on rivers and canals underwent regular improvements. Here's a cross-section showing the Erie Canal's enlargement over the years. And steamboats were incredible technology for moving goods. This heavily laden steamboat could navigate even shallow waters. Can you see what it's loaded with? Cotton. This is America in the 19th century, whose principal export was cotton and getting it from the West, to the ports was a good part of the market for transportation services. Here's an early photograph of my hometown of Cincinnati, with all these steamboats lined up at the public landing. Cincinnati had canals to link her to the Great Lakes, and from there, all the way to New York City. Any farmer along the way had a route to get his goods to world markets, and urban and industrial development likewise benefited from transportation links. But, despite these obvious advantages, it could be tough to get canals built. The Erie Canal was lucky. It was all in New York State, so getting it built was a matter of state financing. If a canal crossed state lines, it was a different story: how to share out the costs and the benefits. The sort of commitment and public enterprise that large-scale transportation improvements required was more common in the North, with its cities and connections. Here, if you withdraw a little bit and get a bigger picture of the canal system of the early United States, you can see how much of this development is concentrated in the North, descending from the Great Lakes and into the riverine Midwest. Local power in the South had very little interest in economic development of the sort that transportation improvements could bring. They'd finance bringing the crops to the port, but industry could threaten the power of agricultural and landed interests, planters with slaves, and those who hoped to climb into their class. Their investments lay in new farmland, not in the intensive or industrial development of land already settled, usually along the rivers. There's more to this story, of course, in the build-up to the Civil War. But basically, the Southern planters, most invested in maintaining their political power, did not spend money on transportation improvements at the same rate as the North. We can trace this story of uneven regional development through the next phase of transportation revolution, too. Remember that the railroads were the next great technology, and they carried both the promise and difficulties of their predecessors. The canals and the road system. Building canals had demonstrated the immense capital cost of the new technologies, costs that could only be repaid over a long period of time, longer than a single lifetime, usually. Why would a person invest in something that was so expensive but took so long to break even, as the costs of all these rails and railbeds and locomotives? Or cutting canals through riverbeds if the state wanted to finance such improvements? How? Through selling bonds and taking on debt. It's in the context of these transportation improvements that we find a legal innovation in corporation law, which allows enterprises to outlive their individual investors, who can sell their shares in a company to someone else, and thereby take some profit. Corporations are legal entities that can outlive their investors, as the shares of the enterprise can be bought or sold. But it's not just private investors who built the railroads. The federal government made a significant contribution to the improvements in transportation times in the 19th century. It simply gave the railroad companies and their investors the land on which to build the railroads. Large portions of national property were simply handed over to private railroad companies for them to use and to sell as part of their profits. Texas wasn't yet a state while all this was happening, and it had no federal lands to give away as a result. This gift of the nation and the government to private enterprise certainly indicates the Whiggish agenda of internal improvements, the Whig Party, and also contributed to the extreme growth of the American economy in the 19th century. The system really grew between 1850, here, and 1860, the year in which Abraham Lincoln was elected, sparking the Civil War. And the centralized coordination and control that accompanied the development of the railroads didn't end there. Even today, the system of time zones is a relic of accommodating railroad development. Before the 19th century, every place had its own time and timekeepers. But a railroad arriving needed to know when the tracks would be clear, so the railroad set the time zones to make sure they were operating as a single unit. That was in the 1880s, and Congress adopted the time zones for the nation as a whole in the 1910s. That's the extent to which the transportation revolution changed our lives, down to knowing what time it is and sharing that knowledge in common. But all of that is in the future, when we're back in the 19th century, trying to explain the coming of the Civil War and the economic growth and economic differentiation between the two regions, North and South, was accelerated by transportation improvements, which were themselves facilitated by changes in law, in systems of financing, and by regional political powers with their specific interests. The result was a nation with different parts on different economic trajectories, even in the case of technological change. And that's where I'll pick it up next time.